A humble young woman is rejected at a restaurant for her simple attire until the millionaire pays her bill. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening, but when she entered that hall lit by crystal chandeliers, wearing a simple dress that already betrayed her origins, no one could have imagined the weight she carried in her heart. The sidelong glances followed her like silent blades, and the waiter's every gesture seemed to reinforce that she didn't belong there. As muffled laughter echoed between glasses of wine and expensive dishes, the young woman tried to maintain her composure, even as shame burned within her. However, no one there was prepared for the moment when the humiliating scene would transform into something unexpected, capable of changing the logic of all those who had scorned her that night. Laughter echoed through the elegant dining room as she entered shyly, wearing a simple dress that clashed with the glitter of the jewels and the expensive perfume in the air. The waiter looked her up and down and sighed impatiently, as if her presence were a mistake. At the next table, two wealthy young women whispered, discreetly pointing to the bicycle parked outside. The waiter handed her the menu, as if tossing a random leaf, and before she could even choose, he announced loudly, "Maybe this isn't the place for someone like you." People at the neighboring tables chuckled, some looked away, but the awkwardness was already there. Her heart raced, her face burned with shame, and yet she held her head high. But that night, amidst the public humiliation, something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change the logic of everyone who judged her. When the bill arrived without her even having tasted the food, her hands trembled on the table. The waiter demanded she pay simply for sitting there, and the customer's laughter sounded like a cruel sentence. It was then that a firm voice broke the silence. "I'll take care of it." The entire room turned, and before her stood an imposing man, discreet in his dark suit, but with a presence that silenced all noise. He handed her the card without hesitation. But it wasn't just the gesture of paying the bill, it was the gaze that held hers, as if recognizing something hidden behind that shame. No one knew it, but that millionaire had come precisely to dine in silence, and found in the scene a painful reminder of his own youth. The laughter stopped, the glances changed, and what seemed like just another public humiliation became the beginning of a turning point that no one in that room would ever forget. If this story has already touched you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the emotional ending. The restaurant that night shone like a movie set. Imposing chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a golden light that made the crystal glasses sparkle and highlighted every detail of the polished cutlery. The soft sound of a piano filled the room, as if every note were designed to match the atmosphere of exclusivity that surrounded the place. It was a space reserved for those who boasted more than just money. There, every gesture, every outfit, every glance was a display of status. People laughed at large tables, toasted, and told stories revolving around travel, luxury cars, and business deals that seemed untouchable to those outside that closed circle. It was into this environment that she entered, shy, with an uncomfortable glint in her eyes, the kind that betrays when someone is out of place. Her dress was simple, made of worn but clean fabric, carefully chosen, as if every thread were a desperate attempt to hide the marks of a hard life. Yet no matter how hard she tried to fit in, the difference was stark, as if an invisible line separated the world of those who belonged there and her own world, fragile but resilient. The first glances came almost immediately. An elegant woman, covered in jewelry, watched her disdainfully, lowering her gaze to her cell phone as if her presence were merely an inconvenience. Two men in sharp suits exchanged a knowing smile, the kind that dispenses words but carries the venom of arrogance. The waiter, noticing her entrance, didn't greet her with his usual courtesy. Instead, he frowned as if anticipating trouble. She, however, undeterred. She walked with firm steps, even though her heart was pounding in her chest, and chose a table near the window from where she could see the Mall. Bicycle parked outside, the only silent witness to her courage in sitting there. There was something almost poetic in the contrast between her and her surroundings. While the lady's expensive perfume wafted, hers was merely the simple freshness of household soap. While designer handbags rested on chairs, she held a small time-worn purse. But amidst that sea of appearances, there was a dignity in her eyes that no jewelry could buy. She wasn't there by chance. Sitting at that table, even if only for a few minutes, was a gesture of resistance, a silent defiance against all the judgmental eyes. The waiter brought the menu curtly, almost as if fulfilling an obligation. He placed it on the table without even smiling, and the young woman opened it slowly, looking at the dishes whose names she could barely pronounce. It didn't matter. For her, the act of being in that space was already greater than any single dish. Around her, the conversation seemed to intensify, as if each burst of laughter was designed to remind her of her position. But even faced with the weight of exclusion, she didn't look away. She stared out the window, took a deep breath, and inside she repeated that nothing and no one would diminish her worth. Meanwhile, across the room, someone was watching her with a different kind of attention. There was no contempt in his gaze, nor any irony. It was a deep, almost searching look, as if the man wanted to decipher the courage hidden behind her every gesture. But, for now, silence reigned. She didn't yet know that that night, marked by the tension of collective contempt, would be the beginning of a story that would unite opposing worlds in a plot of humiliation, silent justice, and inevitable fate. Her past was a mosaic of scars no one saw, but which shaped every silent step she took. From a young age, she had learned that the world was unfair to those born without a surname, without inheritance, and without the protection of a structured family. Her father had disappeared too soon, leaving only vague memories of a tired smile and calloused hands trying to hold the house together. Her overworked mother worked double shifts, cleaning houses that would never be hers, wearing rubber gloves while dreaming of a future that might never arrive. The girl grew up in this environment, hearing the sound of water hitting the floor in other people's kitchens and the creak of squeegees cleaning marble floors, while her own house barely had any tiles. At high school, she had always been the girl in plain clothes, the one who brought her lunch wrapped in plain paper, while the others displayed colorful, imported packaging. Some teachers recognized her intelligence and dedication, but that wasn't enough to shield her from her classmates' laughter. She learned early on to smile quietly, speak softly, and take up as little space as possible, because any gesture could be met with ridicule. Still, there was something inside her that never faded, a deep desire to show that poverty was not a sentence, but merely a passing phenomenon. During her adolescence, she discovered the value of hard work. She cleaned yards, helped out in small grocery stores, and delivered flyers on scorching hot days. Every coin she saved was like a secret trophy, a reminder that she had the strength to fight. While many girls her age dreamed of parties and expensive gifts, she dreamed of independence, of the chance to one day no longer have to choose between paying rent and buying food. It was a silent but tireless desire that kept her getting up every day, even when her legs ached and her soul felt exhausted. The bicycle, her inseparable companion, was more than a means of transportation. It was a symbol of her resilience. With it, she covered vast distances, saving every penny that could have been spent on buses. While others mocked her simplicity, she saw in that worn-out vehicle an opportunity to move, to get wherever she wanted without relying on anyone. There was something poetic about pedaling against the wind, feeling her heart race, and believing that somehow she was conquering a space the world insisted on denying. Even so, the weight of rejection always followed her. There were parties she wasn't invited to, jobs she never got because of her appearance, doors that closed before she could even explain who she was. Each humiliation became an internal scar, but, contrary to what many imagined, it didn't make her bitter. On the contrary, it fueled an even more intense flame within her, as if each no were fuel to prove that one day she would be seen not for the clothes she wore, but for the essence she carried. And it was this essence that led her to that night at the restaurant. It wasn't a whim, it wasn't an attempt to flaunt something she didn't have. It was, in fact, a silent act of courage, a confrontation against all the ghosts that told her she wasn't worthy of occupying those spaces. It was a silent cry to the world. I exist. I belong. Even though she didn't have enough money, Even though her presence made others uncomfortable, she sat at the table as if raising an invisible flag of dignity. Behind every firm look he gave her, there was the child who endured the laughter of her classmates, the teenager who cycled miles to work, the young woman who watched her mother faint from exhaustion and still held her hand. That night, when the waiter treated her like an intruder, he didn't know he was dealing with someone who had faced far worse humiliations and who had learned from an early age to transform pain into resilience. The scene that unfolded that night was not the result of mere chance. As she sat at her simple table, across the room, a group of wealthy young people laughed amid glasses of wine and venomous comments. Among them was the daughter of a well-known businessman in the city, accustomed to measuring people's worth by the cut of their clothes or the brand of their watches. It was she who first discreetly pointed to the bicycle parked outside and ironically commented loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Imagine someone coming here for dinner on a bicycle. It seems like a joke." The laughter multiplied like a silent wave of cruelty, needing no words to ripple across the room and strike straight at the heart of the young woman sitting alone. But it didn't stop there. Someone at the table, inflamed by malice disguised as fun, issued a challenge. "I bet you $100, ye? She can't ask for anything but water. Whoever gets close to her and finds out the truth wins." And so the evening, already fraught with the tension of social difference, turned into a dirty game, a bet of vanity and contempt. Humiliation was no longer a risk, but a spectacle waiting to be seen. The waiter, a silent accomplice to the atmosphere, approached her table with an impatient look. He didn't politely ask what she wanted, just said the words curtly, "You'll just have water, right?" It was. As if he'd already participated in the trial, as if there was no room for the possibility of her being a legitimate customer. Her eyes, however, didn't waver. She looked at him calmly and replied that she'd like a few minutes to choose. The waiter snorted but complied, walking away under the watchful eyes of those waiting for the scene to collapse. The group laughed again, but one detail went unnoticed. There was someone that night who didn't see the situation as amusing. A man sitting at a discreet table away from the main lights watched every gesture. He wasn't interested in the bet nor the comments, but in the quiet strength emanating from that young woman. Still, he didn't intervene. It wasn't the time. He knew that, before any gesture, the truth would have to reveal itself. Meanwhile, the stares grew. The pressure intensified. The young woman clearly realized she had become a target of ridicule, but instead of running away or shrinking, she maintained her composure. Her fingers tapped the menu firmly, even as her heart raced silently. She knew everyone expected her poverty to reveal itself, that she couldn't afford it, that she would be exposed before everyone. But what no one knew was that, behind that simple appearance, there was a secret, something that would completely change the logic of the humiliation they were trying to impose on her. The atmosphere seemed to breathe anticipation. Every muffled laugh, every sidelong glance, every whisper made the scene more intense. It was as if the entire restaurant had become a stage, and she was the main character in a spectacle of cruelty that everyone else was eager to witness. But deep down, she had already learned to deal with such stages. Since childhood, she had always been exposed to the laughter of others, and now once again she would have to show that shame only affects those who embrace it. The silence at their table contrasted with the din of toasts and laughter, but in the air, something was about to happen, something that would transform this cruel gamble into an unexpected turn of events, one no one could have foreseen. Their first encounter happened so unexpectedly that it seemed like a scene carefully planned by a silent fate. She remained at the table, feeling each second drag on like an eternity, when she noticed the same man she had observed from afar calmly rising from his chair. Unlike the others, there was no arrogance in his gestures, nor any haste. He walked firmly, but without ostentation, as if carrying a presence that commanded respect only through silence. The room, which until then had been amused by the cruel game of gambling, was gradually silenced by curiosity. Who could this stranger be approaching the rejected girl? He stopped beside her table, and for a few moments he said nothing, He simply stared at her with a gaze that seemed to pierce the layer of shame surrounding her and reach something much deeper. The young woman, surprised, looked up and found in them not judgment, but a mysterious recognition, as if the man had experienced something similar or held a memory that echoed with the same frequency as her pain. The waiter, uncomfortable, approached to intervene, but the man made a simple gesture with his hand, firm and discreet, that silenced him immediately. It was the first time someone had defended her without having to say a word. The silence that formed around her was almost palpable. People held back their comments, as if the air had thickened. She, nervous, didn't know what to expect. Had he also come to mock her? Did he simply want to further expose the difference between them? But when he pulled out his chair and sat across from her, everything changed. "May I?" he asked in a deep but gentle voice. It was a simple question, but one laden with a respect no one else in the room had ever accorded her. The young woman nodded silently, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, she felt she wasn't alone. The conversation began slowly, almost as if they didn't want to attract attention. He asked her name, and she responded quietly, avoiding revealing too much. She didn't know who he was, didn't know that his signature could generate millions in business, that his face had already graced business magazines, but at that moment that didn't matter. What mattered was the naturalness with which he treated her, as if she were just another person, worthy of respect. With each word, the room around them seemed to tremble, as the curious and surprised gazes couldn't understand why a man of his stature would bother to speak to someone so unassuming. The young men at the betting table looked at each other uneasily. The game seemed to lose its meaning, and the cruel amusement began to turn into an unease none of them had anticipated. With every minute he stood there, talking to the girl in the simple dress, they felt the logic behind their laughter about to crumble. She, in turn, felt her heart race, not out of embarrassment, but because for the first time someone seemed to truly see her beyond her appearance. And so, amidst the tension and awkward silence of those watching, the first invisible thread that would unite the two was born. The direct contact, the firm gaze, the respectful word, the presence that dismantled the certainties of all those who believed that she was destined to leave there defeated. The awkward silence in the room didn't last long. As soon as he sat down at her table, tongues began to wiggle again, but this time in lower, more venomous tones, like snakes hidden between crystal glasses. The laughter was no longer open, but charged with malice, as if the mere fact of a millionaire standing before her were an absurd spectacle. "Has he lost his mind?" someone muttered. "It must be cheap charity," replied another, eliciting more cynical smiles. And while the young woman tried to maintain her dignity, the waiter returned, bringing the weight of the humiliation even more cruelly. With a look of contempt, he raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Sir, the table has already been informed. This customer may not even be able to pay for the water she ordered. We have rules here, understand?" The impact of those words was like a knife piercing the air. People held their breath for a moment before letting out a suppressed burst of laughter. Her face burned with shame. There was no defense against the cruelty of having her poverty exposed as a spectacle. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't look away. She stood erect, firm, as if that posture were her last shield against the audience of strangers. The man in front of her watched her silently, and within that silence was a contained fury, almost imperceptible but real. He could have screamed, could have defended his honor before everyone, but he didn't. He simply looked at the waiter, and the sheer weight of that gaze was enough to make him take a step back. Even so, the damage was done. Laughter echoed through the tables like a cruel orchestra that needed no conductor. She took a deep breath and tried to respond. Her voice trembled, but it came out firmly. "Don't worry. I know exactly what I'm doing here." It was a shock to those who had expected to see her break down. The room hung in suspense for a moment, because there was something in that sentence that sounded bigger than herself, as if she carried a secret no one understood. But before she could continue, one of the young women at the next table stood up, approached, and with a venomous smile whispered loudly enough to echo, "Maybe this dress would be good if we were in a thrift store." The final blow. The laughter exploded shamelessly, as if laughter were a gun fired in all directions. Her heart pounded, but contrary to everyone's expectations, she didn't cry, she didn't run away, she didn't beg. She simply stood there, staring straight ahead with the dignity of someone who had weathered far worse. Storms. The public humiliation was real, but there was also a strange force in the air, as if her very silence were more eloquent than any answer. And at the same time, the millionaire knew. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. Because the collective contempt had just created the perfect opening for a revelation no one expected. The laughter still echoed through the room when, suddenly, she took a deep breath and broke the silence with a sentence that made the air feel heavy. There was no anger in her voice nor any submissiveness. There was firmness, there was calmness. There was something no one expected to hear from the girl humiliated in front of so many eyes. I knew this would happen. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The whispers ceased, and even the waiter, who was bracing himself for another venomous comment, stopped in his tracks. She looked up, fixing her gaze firmly on those laughing the loudest, and continued. "Do you think you're the first to judge me by what I wear, by how I got here? Do you believe the weight of your opinion is new? I grew up hearing laughter like yours. I learned to be diminished before I could even speak. And do you know what that taught me? That the shame isn't mine. It's that of those who need to diminish others to feel great." The words fell like stones, echoing from table to table, dissolving the laughter into discomfort. The businessman's daughter, who had initiated the bet, tried to laugh again, but the sound came out weak, almost choked. The young woman in the simple dress no longer trembled. On the contrary, she seemed larger, illuminated by an invisible strength that came from within, from that which is only achieved when a lifetime has been marked by trials. She rested her hands on the table, leaned forward slightly, and said without raising her voice, "You made a bet, didn't you? You wanted to see if I would be humiliated, if I would rush to the table or cry to entertain you. Well, I already knew. From the moment I walked in, I felt the eyes, heard the giggles, and caught every whisper. I didn't need anyone to tell me, because I already know this script by heart. They just didn't know I came prepared to look everyone in the eye and show them that none of this can destroy me anymore." The millionaire sitting before her remained silent, but an unexpected admiration grew within him. It wasn't just courage he saw, it was experience transformed into resilience. She didn't just endure humiliation. She exposed the ridicule of those who inflicted it. It was as if her every word was a mirror in which the aggressors finally saw themselves naked in their own cruelty. The customers who had previously laughed now looked away, embarrassed. The waiter, tray in hand, seemed dwarfed by the grandeur emanating from her. The group that had initiated the bet shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, and the room, so accustomed to being a stage for ostentation, now became the scene of silent, poetic justice. She didn't raise her voice, shed a tear, or plead for respect. She simply revealed that she had known everything all along, and this revelation was the turning point no one saw coming. In that instant, without even realizing it, she had become bigger than the place, bigger than the expensive clothes, bigger than all those who tried to diminish her. And, unknown to anyone yet, her words would be only the prelude to an even more profound revelation, one that would change not only the millionaire's perception, but the fate of everyone who witnessed that night. His gaze remained fixed, as if each of her words had pierced not only the silence of the room, but also the walls of his own memory. That firmness, that calm in the face of humiliation, was unusual. He knew that posture well because he had seen it before, not on her but on someone else, in another time when he was still just a boy lost in poverty, before money and business had made him a respected name in the city. The memory came to him in a flash, almost painful. A small suburban community, a simple school, and a girl who, even when teased, never bowed down before others. Could it be the same one? As his heart raced with this doubt, one of the young women at the next table, perhaps unaware of the gravity of what she was about to reveal, let slip a venomous comment. "She's only here because she works at the community grocery store, the one that delivers food baskets to needy families. I bet she came to spend what little she managed to save, just to pretend she's part of our world." The grocery store. The word rang like a bell inside his mind. He knew that place because it was there, as a child, that his mother would seek food when money was tight. It was in that grocery store that an employee, always smiling despite her exhaustion, would say to him, "One day you'll be someone important. Never forget that." He felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The pieces began to fall into place, almost cruelly. This young woman before him, humiliated in front of everyone, was not just another stranger. She was the daughter of the woman who, years ago, had fed his family when all they had was debt and hunger. His blood ran cold at the memory. How many times had his mother wept in secret, and it was this very woman, simple and invisible to the world, who offered her not only food, but words of encouragement. Now, there before him, stood the silent heir to that dignity. The millionaire couldn't help it. His eyes welled up, but he didn't let anyone see it. Inside, he felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. Shame for having forgotten where he came from, for having allowed himself to sit so many times at tables like that, laughing at jokes similar to the ones she was experiencing. Gratitude for having the chance to repay, in some small way, the invisible debt he'd carried since childhood. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. The room, however, was already sensing something strange. His silence, his fixed eyes on her, his heavy expression, everything betrayed that there was more to this story than anyone present could imagine. While others still believed this was just another night of humiliation, he already knew. He had found the missing link to his own past, and the young woman, without realizing it, was the bridge between who he had been and who he had become. In that moment, it wasn't just her who was exposed. He was too, because discovering who she truly was meant facing the ghosts of her own origins, the same ones she'd tried to bury beneath luxury and power. But now, before her, there was no escape. The secret of the past had returned, and with it, the certainty that nothing would be the same from that night onward. The evening ended abruptly, as if fate had decided to end the show before the final act. After facing stares and laughter, after revealing that she already knew everything, the young woman rose from the table unhurriedly, without tears, simply with the same silent dignity she had maintained until then. The millionaire tried to follow her with his eyes, but amid the movement of waiters clearing away dishes and the renewed hubbub of the room, she simply disappeared. By the time he got up to look for her, it was too late. The door had closed behind her, and outside, only her bicycle remained, slowly moving away into the darkness of the street lit by ancient streetlights. At first, he thought it was just another unexpected departure, that perhaps he'd run into her again by chance. But the days turned into weeks, and each of her absences began to weigh like an invisible debt. Business appointments no longer held the same luster. Meetings in glass-enclosed offices felt hollow, and even sophisticated dinners seemed tasteless. In every unfamiliar face, he searched for a trace of her, as if fate were playing hide-and-seek with someone he could no longer ignore. It was strange. He had lived with countless people in his life, frequented luxurious environments and met powerful people, but none of them had left the silent mark on him of that girl in the simple dress. Perhaps it was her courage, perhaps it was her gaze that refused to yield to contempt. Perhaps it was the memory of his own origins that she had unknowingly brought back. The fact is, since that night, nothing seemed complete. He began to frequent places he would never have noticed before. He went to the community store, trying to find some clue. He asked discreetly, but the answer was always the same. She would come, help, and then leave silently like someone who didn't want to be found. He went to the simple neighborhood where he had grown up, hoping some street or memory would show him the way. But he found only old memories, distant voices that reminded him of when he himself was invisible, as she was now. Her absence began to become a mirror. In the silence of his mansion, surrounded by expensive furniture and cold walls, he increasingly found himself facing emptiness. He had money, he had power, but he lacked the lightness of that discreet strength she carried. It was as if, by disappearing, she had taken a part of him with her, a part he only now realized he needed to rediscover. And it was in this emptiness, in this almost painful absence, that he began to feel something he never thought possible. longing for someone he barely knew, but who had completely changed the way he saw himself and the world. Her absence wasn't just a void in his life. It was the beginning of a series of events that seemed to exact a forgotten debt. Until then, the millionaire had been seen as an untouchable man. Solid business, an impeccable image, enough power to silence any voice that dared to oppose him. But as if fate had decided to balance the books, small cracks began to appear. First, there were rumors that in an important negotiation he had ignored ordinary employees, treating them as disposable parts. Then, an article in a local newspaper questioned how a man born poor now seemed to have completely forgotten his roots. They were rumors, scattered comments, but together they created a silent storm that threatened his reputation. The hardest blow, however, came from where he least expected it. At a charity event, surrounded by cameras and flashes, someone publicly mentioned that he had been seen that night at the restaurant, sitting next to a humble girl who later disappeared. The questions began to pour in. Who was she? Why was he with someone like her? Was he taking advantage of her status to appear generous? What had been a private moment of reflection for him turned into a public spectacle. His silence, his attempt to preserve her dignity, was interpreted as coldness, and headlines carried harsh statements, accusing him of trying to buy respect through calculated gestures. He, who had always been admired as an example of resilience, was now judged a hypocrite. Business friends began to drift away. Once frequent invitations ceased, and the glow of power seemed to slip through his fingers. The cruelest thing was realizing that the very people who had once applauded him were now pointing fingers, as if they were just waiting for the right moment to bring him down. And deep down he knew it wasn't just bad luck. It was karma. It was the weight of years of turning a blind eye to the suffering of others, of choosing to mingle with those who laughed at their pain. The scene of the girl in the restaurant replayed in his mind over and over, and the more he remembered her dignity in the face of humiliation, the more he felt his own smallness. It wasn't just the public judgment that hurt him, it was the internal judgment, the certainty that he had become everything he had once sworn to fight. The fall wasn't as thunderous as an empire crumbling in a single day. It was slow, silent, almost poetic. Every door that closed, every glance that turned away, every headline, laden with irony, was like a blade slicing through his image. And in the silence of his own conscience, he began to understand. He was reaping exactly what he had allowed others to sow in his life. Falls have a strange power. They reveal more than they take away. In the days following the beginning of his public decline, the millionaire realized he was no longer haunted just by reporters or the shadow of shattered business dealings, but by something much greater, his own conscience. For the first time in years, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The expensive suits, the luxury watches, the house filled with works of art could no longer hide the emptiness spreading within. He realized he had built an empire that was solid on the outside, but fragile on the inside, sustained by appearances, by self-satisfied smiles, and by a pride that now weighed him down like invisible chains. Childhood memories began to invade his nights, as if ghosts returned to collect a soul debt. He saw himself running barefoot through the simple streets, remembered his sweaty mother returning from work with small bags, remembered the encouraging words of the worker at the community grocery store, the one who had given him food and hope when nothing else seemed possible. The image of her daughter, now transformed into a strong woman in the face of humiliation, surfaced in every thought, not as a reminder of pain, but as a mirror. It was as if God had used that scene to tear away the mask he himself had constructed. The transformation began in detail. He began to decline empty invitations to parties where no one was telling him anything real. He began walking alone through the city, looking at faces he had previously ignored, listening to stories that had previously disinterested him. He discovered that beneath the skyscrapers and artificial lights, there was a real world made up of people who struggled daily, just as he had once struggled. The money was still in his account, but it was no longer his prison. It was just a resource, nothing more. In the silence of the early morning hours, sitting in his library, he reflected on what truly mattered. And there, far from the cameras and the judgments, he cried, as he hadn't cried since he was a boy. They weren't tears of defeat, but of liberation. Each tear washed away a layer of pride. Each sob shattered a wall he had built around himself. His public downfall had exposed his vanity, but at the same time it had given him the chance to start over. He didn't seek redemption in newspapers or public speeches. His transformation was intimate, invisible, but real. The man who once lived to be seen now simply wanted to see himself truthfully, to see others without masks, to see life simply. And deep down he knew this change wasn't complete, because there was an absence that still lingered within him, a void in the form of a woman in a simple dress who had disappeared that night. Finding her was no longer a whim, nor a social obligation. It was the final step in his own transformation. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious restaurant, nor at a public event surrounded by cameras. Life, with its silent irony, chose a much simpler setting. It was a cloudy afternoon with a cold wind cutting through the narrow streets of a neighborhood forgotten by the rush of the city. He had begun visiting these places almost daily, seeking a meaning that luxury no longer gave him when he saw her in the distance, emerging from a small church with peeling wooden doors, carrying a bag filled with books and food. His heart stopped for a moment. The world, with all its noise surrounding him, went silent. It was her. For a moment, he didn't have the courage to approach. He stood still, observing every detail, the firm way she walked, the attentive eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances, the simplicity of her gestures that conveyed a dignity impossible to buy. But the absence had been too long, and the desire to atone for his own cowardice spoke louder. He took a few steps and called her name. She stopped. The wind seemed to freeze around her. Slowly he turned, and when her eyes met his, there was no smile, no exaggerated surprise. There was only a heavy silence laden with everything that had been suspended since that night. He approached with measured steps, almost afraid to break the invisible barrier she had erected. He tried to speak, but the words seemed too small for the immensity of what he needed to say. "I looked for you," he murmured, his voice breaking. She held his gaze steady and replied calmly, "I know." There was no explicit resentment, no immediate welcome. There was only the knowledge that she had always known he would look for her, but that didn't mean it would be easy. The street, silent and simple, became the stage for something much greater. He spoke of his downfall, of how the public trial had transformed him, of how memories of the past haunted him until he realized he needed to change. He confessed that he had discovered who she was, that he knew about the connection to the community store, that his mother owed her mother far more than she could ever repay. Every word came out as an unrehearsed but necessary apology. She listened silently. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just let him expose his own wounds. When he finished, there was a heaviness in the air that seemed impossible to dispel. It was then that she took a few steps toward him. His eyes, which had once reflected so much pain and resistance, now held something different, a truth that needed no embellishment. "I never needed your money. I never needed your defense. I just wanted someone to see me for who I am." And that night, for an instant, you saw it. Her words pierced him like blades and, at the same time, like balm. There lay the essence of it all. It wasn't about financial debt, status, or appearances. It was about humanity, about seeing and being seen truthfully. The reunion didn't bring easy answers, but it did bring a chance to start over, to fix not only what had happened that night, but what he had allowed to be lost throughout his life. In that moment, before a forgotten church and a dark sky, the millionaire and the humble young woman truly met for the first time, not as symbols of opposing worlds, but as souls marked by the same destiny, each bearing their own scars, ready to decide what to do with them from then on. The cold wind still cut through the street when the silence between them seemed to stretch like an invisible wall. He had spoken. He had confessed. He had exposed the wounds he had never shown to anyone. Now, the answer was no longer in his hands, but in hers. The young woman kept her eyes fixed on him, and in that gaze carried the weight of the entire history that bound them together, even without him having realized it before. There was the pain of a lifetime of humiliation. There was the dignity of someone who had never let poverty define his worth, and there was also the doubt. To what extent had this man truly changed? She took a few steps closer, but not to embrace him or forgive him immediately. Her words came low, firm, filled with a serenity that made him tremble more than any public accusation. You fell, and in the depths of that fall, you remembered who you were. But don't think that remembering alone is enough to redeem yourself. Forgiveness isn't a bargaining chip. It's not charity, it's not a spectacle. It's a decision, and I still don't know if I'm ready to give it to you. His heart seemed to drop again. There was no anger in her tone, but there was truth, and truth hurts more than contempt. She continued, I spent my entire life being judged for not having enough, and now you show up with your transformation story, expecting me to be the seal of your change. But it's not about you. It's about me, about what I need to choose for my own life. Her eyes welled up, but her voice didn't waver. I can forgive you now and maybe move on, or I can say goodbye and let you learn to live with the lack. Because sometimes it's absence that teaches more than presence. He wanted to respond, wanted to say he would do anything, that he wasn't seeking absolution but the opportunity to make amends, to be close. But the force of her words silenced him. He realized there was nothing he could promise or offer at that moment. Fate was not in his hands. The decision was hers, and in that moment, amid the heavy silence of the deserted street, he understood that the greatest act of power she had ever made in her entire life was not resisting humiliation, but now, before him, choosing what to do with her story. His breath was held, his eyes silently imploring, but she took her time. She simply took a deep breath, raised her face to the cloud-laden sky, and let time decide whether there would be forgiveness or goodbye. And in the uncertainty of that moment, he felt that life was teaching him the hardest and truest lesson. Love and forgiveness are not won with money or speeches, but with respect for the other person's freedom to choose. She didn't answer right away. She simply walked a few steps to the middle of the empty street, stopped and looked around, as if the whole world could fit in that suspended moment. The grey sky was beginning to open in slits of golden light, and the first rays of dusk gently touched his face. He remained, still watching, fearing any gesture that might drive her away for good. And then, silently, she set the bag down, climbed onto her bike, and gripped the handlebars tightly. There were no tears, no smiles, only choice. Slowly she began pedaling down the street, the sound of her wheels cutting through the asphalt like distant music. He didn't try to stop her. He simply followed her with his eyes, as if witnessing something unstoppable. As she walked away, her figure seemed to blend into the soft light falling over the neighborhood. It was as if fate had decided that, for now, this was the necessary outcome. Her moving forward, free, and him standing still, his heart open for the first time in years. As the bicycle turned the corner and disappeared, the millionaire took a deep breath. The emptiness returned, but it wasn't the same. There was no more pride, no more masks, only one certainty. Life had given him the chance to change, and he wouldn't let it slip away. The silence of the street was the answer he needed. It didn't matter if forgiveness would come one day or if it would never return. What mattered was that, for the first time, he understood that he didn't need to be applauded or feared. He just needed to be human. And on that simple afternoon, with no witnesses other than the wind and the light piercing the clouds, the story found its symbolic end. Not with hugs, not with promises, but with the image of a bicycle disappearing into the distance, carrying with it all the dignity that neither money nor contempt nor humiliation could steal. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your every gesture helps us continue to bring you stories that move you, spark reflection, and demonstrate that life always has unexpected twists and turns in store.